Hey there, I'm Ryan and welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll also have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, this channel is predominantly fan-funded, so if you feel like you're enjoying, you're having fun, you're learning things, do consider checking out the Patreon. We do have a lot of fun things up there on top of the reference photos and traceables, like that of my ebooks, and even a bunch of polls. So, a bunch of fun stuff. Do check it out if you're enjoying. But with that, let's jump into it and have some fun. We're going to begin here today with a 9 by 12 inch canvas and a 1 inch flat-headed brush. From there, I'll dip the bottom third into some water, condensing our bristles and ensuring that our paint does stay wet for a longer period of time. With that, on to step number 1. So we're going to grab quite a bit of our titanium white, about 1/10 that in ultramarine blue, about 2/10 Mars black, and then we'll mix that up fairly consistently. That way we don't have any areas that are a little bit brighter, a little bit darker. Then I do add in some extra blue, so it's about an even mixture of the Mars black and ultramarine blue. We test it on our canvas and we realize it's far too dark. So I add in some additional titanium white, hoping to get it closer to the color of the sky, and right there we do get that value. However, we do have an issue. It's not saturated enough. So I add in some of our extra ultramarine blue, still not saturated enough. I go in to add in more, and the next result is actually quite interesting because it's definitely more blue, but now, as you can see, it actually got darker again, which makes sense because the ultramarine blue is a darker pigment than what our mix looked like, but it meant that I had to go in and add additional titanium white, and this right here is actually perfect. So I tap that on, love the color, love the value, and we are on to the canvas. So friendly reminder, don't always go with the first color you mix. Generally, it can be improved upon. And I wanted to start things off by not showing the perfect initial mixture, but showing you how I get to my mixes and ensure that I do actually color match correctly, because I want you to be able to take these ideas and these lessons into your future paintings as well. With that, we are getting into the canvas here, and I'm painting all of the clouds in the background, and here the clouds are very soft, right? We don't see a lot of form, but it's not as bright as the actual sky. I'm covering up a lot of my drawings for the midground and the foreground because it's a lot easier to paint your foreground subjects on top of the background rather than kind of interweaving them back and forth. Generally, when you try to do that, you end up with edges that kind of look just a little unfinished. Sometimes you can see the canvas through it. So we are opting to avoid that. I'm going over a lot of it with these horizontal strokes, and I'd also like to note that the majority of this lesson, as you can probably tell by the time of the video, is going to be in real time. However, when things get a little monotonous, a little repetitive, I am going to speed up that footage. That way you don't have to watch me painting a sky for 25 minutes doing multiple layers. So yeah, we're going ahead, doing a couple of layers, and I love that coverage. So jumping into step number 2, here we are yet again starting with quite a bit of titanium white. This time, however, we're going to be using more Mars black and ultramarine blue. We are going to start crafting the lower clouds, which aren't going to be receiving as much light, right? Because there are clouds on top of it, which are essentially stopping that light from getting to them, and therefore, again, we just need something a little bit darker. Now, I'm mixing this, as you can see, right on top of / beside our initial mixture. That way I can see what it'll look like in contrast with what we have on the canvas. I made it slightly too dark, so I add in some additional titanium white. And here, yet again, we are quite close. I kind of paused for a second, think to myself, is that really what we want? And I do want it to be a little bit darker. I want it to be a little bit more saturated. We go for another test, and there, as you can see, already improvement. Very happy with that. And we are on to the canvas. So here, it's actually kind of interesting. It probably looks quite a bit more blue than it did on the palette, and that's really happening because of the time of day and the natural light that's coming in. It's important to consider where you're painting and the lighting that your painting and your palette are going to have on them, because it will differ. If you're painting in the afternoon with natural light, you're probably going to get a nice warm orange, nice warm glow to it. and that'll distort your view of the actual painting. So in that process, do make sure that you're kind of taking that into account, but I do like it both with the gray look and with the blue, so I'm pretty happy either way. With that, we do fill in the entirety of the bottom cloud. And now over the edge, I'm going very softly back and forth, dragging the paint up. And you can see that it's starting to create this granular effect as we move into the sky. What we're looking to do is create a soft blend with our wet into dry paint, and it's quite interesting, really. This is going to work better right now because I made my brush slightly more damp. The more damp you make your brush, the more you thin your paint, and the more your paint is thinned, the more you can see the underlayers show through it. So as you can see, now we are able to get a bit of a smoother application, blending rather quickly because I did speed up the footage. But when you do all of that blending, sometimes you can start to rip off the paint from the canvas, and we don't want that. So I did go in and add a second layer, then I grabbed more of the color that I used for the sky, and we're going to use this to blend now wet into wet. So you can see what blending wet into dry looks like. It's a little bit more granular. You can see the tooth of the canvas, but when we now add that color from the sky back into the wet new cloud pigment, we get something that's very smooth, very soft looking. So a couple of different ways of going about it. I'm going to try to keep that bottom sharp edge of the cloud fairly prominent. That way we do have a distinctive feature. I think it looks interesting. I will soften it a little bit, but for the most part, we are going to keep that in there. And here I'm just continuously going back, adding more of that sky color, or rather higher cloud cover, and blending it down into these. I want something nice and soft. That way it isn't distracting from everything that we have in the middle ground and foreground. It's going to be a very detailed piece, and you don't want every element of the painting to look incredibly detailed. Otherwise, you really won't give the eye anything to focus on. It's also worth noting that here I am going in and doing a second layer, and I really advocate for that in your paintings. I think something that generally really differentiates beginner painters from advanced intermediate painters is just the amount of paint people are willing to commit to the canvas. So start with a thin layer, make sure that your colors are correct, that you have your subjects where you want to, but then go back, let it dry, and then add another layer. So now we get to have some fun by painting a fairly simple distant mountain. Again, we are painting in the background, so we don't want it to be overly complicated, but we are definitely mixing more of a gray. We will still use a little bit of a blue because we want it to be cohesive. We have all of this blue atmospheric light going on in the painting, and so I try to mix our snow color there and say, you know what, yet again, it is too dark, and that is something that you should keep in mind. Generally, I mix to be a little bit darker just naturally. Some people mix to be a little bit lighter. It's good to be aware of your habits. That way you can work with them and really achieve the colors you want from an earlier stage. But here we do end up getting to that correct snow color. And I'm actually going to paint over all of the trees that the mountain will eventually have. And I'm going to work around the roof of the house, around the tree. So a lot of fairly sharp work going on here, but it's not all that difficult because the 1-inch flat-headed brush has a sharp edge, and it really is great for working on detail as well. Really wonderful. Now, as I blend up into the cloud here, I'm being very soft with my brush. I want to lift some of that paint up, but bring it on top of that darker blue. That way we get that nice transparent gradient. I have a little bit of water on my brush, so it's slightly more soft than what we were working with beforehand, but I think that looked fairly good, and with that we are back to our palette. Now here I'm mixing up something quite a bit darker. As you can see, we have more of our Mars black, more of our ultramarine blue, though there is additional titanium white because I don't want it to be truly dark. I don't want the background to be too high contrast, otherwise all of the contrast in the foreground won't really pop. So we're very close with that mixture, but I do think it is still slightly too dark upon testing it. So we add more of that titanium white to our mixture. I accidentally mixed in a little bit of extra blue, so again, more with that titanium white, and that looks really fantastic. So now I'm switching to the liner brush, which is great for detail work. Really, really tiny top of the head there. Really fantastic for rendering trees in the distance and details in the rock, which we'll also be doing. Now, I go into here, and you can see that I initially made that stroke from the top, and I moved my brush down. Wouldn't recommend that. Generally, it's best to do distant trees by starting at the bottom of them and then lifting up. And as you lift up, you remove the brush from the canvas, you pull it back. That way, the first application, the first area of contact is the widest. You are applying the most amount of paint, and then as you drag upwards and you move your brush back, you are applying less paint because you've already used up a fair amount, and on top of that, you are taking the bristles off the canvas, which makes the trees have a bit of a taper effect, right? Because the more pressure you apply with your brush, the wider the application will be because you have more bristles pushing against the canvas, and that widens the application area. But when you pull the brush away, when you apply less pressure, you have less of your bristles touching the canvas, and therefore we just really want to ensure that throughout all of these motions, we're being cognizant of the amount of pressure we're working with. And with that, I did create quite a large cluster of trees, as you can see, but as we get higher up, I start to make them a bit more sparse. We have more openings, and it is acting as a bit of a leading line down into the painting, into this higher contrast area. And when you end up painting these clusters of trees, I think a lot of people are initially worried that they're going to lose detail, that all of those strokes are going to start blending together and it's not going to look as sharp as it once did. And that is going to happen, but that isn't a bad thing. Realistically, in nature, when you look into the distance and you look at different subjects, visually, optically, these things blend together. And that is something that's important that we incorporate here because we do want it to look like the background. Again, we don't want it to distract from the foreground, and having all of these trees layered on together and not necessarily create a large contrast is really going to benefit the piece later on. Right now, you'll probably look at it and you'll say, oh, that could use some more detail. But hold off. Don't do that. It will look better if you just kind of trust in the process and the fact that through the painting, it will complement everything else you do quite well. So with that, I am going in and doing more layers, building up the thickness in the trees here on the left-hand side of the canvas. I'm still going from the bottom, lifting that brush upwards. I'm going with a general pattern. You can see that the trees are moving down the mountain. It gives the mountain dimension despite the fact that we didn't add a gradient to the mountain. We didn't go out of our way to make it look three-dimensional. We are making it look three-dimensional through the subjects which are on it, which are moving down it, which are getting slightly bigger as we get closer to us in the foreground. And that's another important thing to consider. When subjects are farther away, because of perspective, they're going to look smaller. So the trees that are closest to us on this mountain, you can make them slightly longer, you can make the bases slightly more thick, and it's little details like that that'll have a big impact. I'm also now very roughly just drawing on a larger tree, which we are going to incorporate in the painting a little bit later on. And I'm doing that for a couple of reasons, but the primary one here is that I wanted to draw on a lot of the showing rock that's a little bit higher on the mountain that isn't covered in snow, and I'm using the tree as almost a ruler, a point of reference as to how high these rocks should be, where these additional subjects should be. I'm just looking at the reference photo. If you are up on Patreon, you'll also have the traceable as well. So a lot of different little resources you can use here, but you can see that the rocks vary quite dramatically. Here I'm just doing these very small little taps, trying to create different shapes each time. We want that diversity to really sell the realism here. And now we get a little bit higher and we get to a much larger rock face. Now, this is all going to look very abstract initially and probably even a little bit messy. Just try to ensure that your applications are relatively opaque, that they aren't too see-through, and you're going to end up in a good place. Again, you also don't want them to be too dark because otherwise they'll take away from your foreground later on. Again, you could make this very dimensional. You could add a lot of contrast. You could make some areas bright, some areas dark. You could do a lot more detail than I'm doing. However, it would contradict with the rest of the painting later on, and we're going to get a lot more depth by keeping this soft. So do try to keep your mixes relatively light. There you can see that the rocks on the top of the mountain are starting to get a little bit darker. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And the rocks that I'm currently working on, you can see that I'm actually having a bit of a difficult time applying the paint to the canvas, and that's just because my brush is a little bit damp and I'm not able to apply paint because there's so much water there. This is an issue that I think we all go through, and even when you've been painting for 15 years, it can still happen. But if you have that issue, you can either force paint on it by using a lot of paint, or just let it dry completely. Takes 5-10 minutes, go back in, and you'll have no troubles at all. So just be aware of that. But I was using the water so that I could thin the paint so that it didn't look as opaque, so that it would be a little bit brighter, which is something I want as I kind of move up the mountain a little bit, because then it'll look like it's getting lost behind some of the larger, more thick clouds. So there's a lot you can play with here. And here we are just kind of going back in, painting the very top of the mountain, though it's going to disappear behind the clouds. And the clouds aren't very definitive at this point, so we're going to go back. We're going to paint an addition to that darker application that we did earlier. But right now I'm just trying to make sure that the top edges are nice and sharp, that it is nice and opaque at the top. And then as you move down, I'm softening, and you can see that I'm using my finger there to do so. I'm a big fan of finger painting, always have been, always will be. I think it's a useful tool, but I like that a lot. And again, we can definitely create more of a contrast with our clouds and separate things that will look quite natural. So now I'm just finishing up a couple of the rocks, but so far so good, and this is going to look really great down the line. So our next step here is to grab some of that additional ultramarine blue, a little bit of Mars black, work that in to the brighter color that we had for the sky, because I did have a bit of that left wet on my palette, and I'm just trying to remix the darker pigment that we used for the clouds. So once I have that, I'm going to go and paint the mountain right on top, right in between the peak and essentially the middle of the mountain. We're going to try to make the middle of this application fairly opaque, but as we get towards the edges, we do want it to be much more soft. We want that natural gradient. We want it to look like the edges of this cloud are semi-transparent. And the way of going about that, again, is to go over the top and the bottom with a very soft application, not applying much pressure at all. We do want our brush to be fairly damp. That way we have enough water to blend this pigment out over our previously applied dry pigment. And I think that it is working quite nicely. Though the color was slightly off, so I moved it more into the center as well, just so things felt a little bit more cohesive. I think that worked out really wonderfully here. But again, the goal is to have an opaque middle to make sure that the top is fairly soft, the bottom is fairly soft, and now we have a bit of mystery in the mountain, and I definitely think that it adds some extra depth. So I like that a lot, and now we're just using the liner brush to fill in some of the brighter areas. So from there, we're going to start working on our distant trees, and we're doing so with the 1-inch flathead brush. Again, it's just such a versatile tool. We are grabbing quite a bit of Mars black, about an equal mixture of our ultramarine blue, hint of our titanium white, because we do want a dark mixture. And upon applying it, I realized that it is a little bit too bright. Right now, I'm looking for the darkest value within those trees that we can build on top of. This really is just our base layer. And so here, we're going back a couple of times. I'm trying to darken it, but I'm also using the extra blue to give it that saturation back. We do want those nice cool blues kind of reflecting on these distant trees. And once I have what I want, I'm going to use this brush and the very sharp edge of it to cut around our house, the base of our kind of snowy mound which it sits upon, and I'm also just going to fill in that layer. Now my brush is a little bit damp, so as you can see the initial pigment is a little bit thin, so I go over it a couple of times. We're trying to be fairly soft, that way we don't create a streaky application, and then I do decide to actually move in my house a little bit. So that's also something you can do through this process. You can kind of restructure if you feel you need to or want to. But once I have that initial application down, I switch to the liner brush and we start moving from the bottom up creating some fairly nice sharp points at the top. Now, I want each of these points to be nice and diverse. I want some of them to be taller, some of them to be thicker, smaller. Really, we're just going for whatever looks organic and natural, because realistically, if you're out and you're looking at the forest, all of the trees probably aren't going to be the same size, right? They have different ages, they've, endured different things, and it's important to make them fairly unique. So yet again, we're going in and working on that. Here you can see that I'm actually starting from the top and working my way down, which is definitely a more difficult way of going about it. As you can see, we started with the largest stroke and then it tapered down, which is the exact opposite of what we want. So I do switch that up. I go back to working from the bottom upwards in the same way we did with our smaller trees. And it's always neat to see when one technique can kind of find its way into another area, and that's exactly what's happening there. But once we have that, I do mix in some additional titanium white to that mixture, and we don't want it to be a pure titanium white. We don't want it to be too bright. It really is just a little bit of titanium white in the last application. And from there, I'm creating the protruding pieces of the trees which are going to accumulate snow, right? A lot of these do stick out. That snow is going to fall, it is going to land, it is going to build up, and that is what's going to show the shape in this larger block of trees. This is where we have an opportunity to create some detail. So I start by creating some trees which are a fair distance apart. That way they don't connect, they don't kind of initially give us kind of a confusing visual. And now I'm going to start kind of working my way in between them once I have their general shape done. But for the most part, this is done with little taps with the liner brush. I'm trying to, a little bit later on, work in the general direction of the foliage, the way in which the branch is going to be falling. I try to move in that direction. That way we have a fairly distinctive left and right hand side of the tree, and the middle is definitely a combination which can make the whole thing a whole lot more interesting. So we are again working with some space. We go and we fill in the middle, and if you feel like you are losing the actual shape of the tree in this process, don't worry about it. That is going to happen. It isn't necessarily a bad thing. Again, the distant subjects as a whole need to be significantly more simple. And now we can take some titanium white, go back in and differentiate a couple of them should we want to. But this new highlight, it's going to push some of the trees a little bit closer to us in the foreground, and it's going to make them stand out more, right? So we're building quite a bit of depth in a very simple way, and we just needed that very basic background to build on top of, and now we're picking our favorite trees, we're highlighting them, we're building them up, we're accentuating the general movements, which we ended up liking. So the last layer was kind of like a trial run for this very definitive application here. Though I'm still not going with a pure titanium white. I want things to look relatively soft as we are still working in that background area. But so far, so good. Now for our next step, I am going to be working with Conte, which is essentially a sharp chalk, and it's spelled C-O-N-T-E. This can be purchased at most art and craft stores. You can find it on Amazon, but I'm just going to use the blue here to sketch in some of the trees which we did cover up, and I like to use this because it generally comes off with water. It doesn't really dilute the pigment, and with that, we can move on to step number 7. Now we're going to start creating the darker base layer for all of our trees in the foreground. And as you can see, we are using a lot of Mars Black, about half that in Ultramarine blue, and just a hint of a titanium white as well. This, again, does need to be that dark pigment at the core of the tree. We will be layering our mid values, our highlights, and our snow on top of it, but this is what we are going to use as that base layer. And so when I go to apply it, I'm still using that 1-inch flat-headed brush, and rather than creating a nice, clean, sharp stroke down the tree, I'm going in, I'm doing a little bit of a tap I take my brush off the canvas, move it down, then do another tap, and I repeat that process. I do this so that we get a much more organic application. It doesn't look soft, it doesn't look pristine, and it makes it look like the tree has some real character, and each of them is going to look quite different. So I really love this technique for creating the trunk of the tree and the general movement. You can also do a little bit of a combination style-wise where you do the tap and then you do a little bit of a drag and then you do the tap and you do a little bit of a drag. Even that I think is significantly better than starting at the top or bottom and then just creating that clean line. It works well in the background for our distant trees because we don't want them to be all that detailed. We don't want to take attention away with them, and they're so far away that you couldn't really differentiate all of those little movements. But now that we're getting close to us, we want to ensure that we are really considering that. With that, we are now going to start creating some of the protruding branches, and we're going to do this still with the 1-inch flat-headed brush. We want the majority of our small branches initially at the top to be pointed outwards in an interesting direction, right? It's moving up because those branches don't have a lot of weight to them. However, as we get towards the middle of the tree, as you will very soon see, I start to make my applications a bit more horizontal rather than pointed in that upwards direction. And as we get towards the bottom later, we'll start to actually curve it downwards because the branches just have so much weight, they can't move up, they can't stand in a horizontal position. And so you're going to have this really interesting progression as you move down your tree. And as I get towards the white of the canvas, I essentially want it to start to get to that horizontal point. It's also worth noting that we are pressing harder with our brush as we get towards that middle area of the tree, and we'll continue to do that as you move towards the bottom because again, when you press very softly with your brush, you get a very small application. Not a lot of bristles make contact with the canvas. When you press hard, you create a lot of that application. It's quite large. You get significantly more foliage, significantly more branch. And so we definitely save that for the middle to the bottom area where you do want to cover quite a lot of space. At the top, those areas haven't had time to grow yet, so we want them to be quite small. I'm using the corner of the brush to do a lot of that, where when I get towards the middle, I'm using the full head of the brush. So again, we're progressively changing things as we move down the tree. We are applying more pressure, we are going in with more of a horizontal angle, and we're also trying to fill things in as well, where at the top you certainly have more openings, more small holes in between branches, and again, that'll all give it quite a bit of character. But once I'm done with the two largest trees, I switch over to the 1/2-inch flat-headed brush. This one is, again, just about half the size of the 1-inch flat-headed brush, and it's really good because it allows us to continue to create with the same application, the same level of detail, but with slightly more precision. Right? We're still creating a fairly similar sized application, but because it's smaller, I can kind of work with more attention to detail, and I don't have to worry about the other end of my brush coming in and tapping a far out area of the tree and then having to create a branch for that. So here, as you can see, I do just kind of start to move down in the canvas a little bit, and the paint is getting rather thin, rather see-through. So I move back up to the top. I say, you know what, we'll just start crafting some of the other limbs. And what's really interesting about painting your initial layer of foliage and branches with a fairly watered down application is that it's all semi-transparent, so it looks a bit more blue, it looks a bit more far away. So when you go to paint your second application of those branches of that foliage with a much more thick, opaque, dark pigment, it looks quite three-dimensional. It looks like you have these branches that are a little bit farther away, they're catching more of that blue light, and it can be really interesting. It can also look a little bit messy, so you do need to be fairly cautious with it, the amount you do and the amount of style you incorporate there, but it certainly is an option to create a little bit of additional depth. Here you can see that we are speeding up a bit of that footage just because it was a fairly lengthy period of time where we were painting that, and the application itself, the amount of detail, the way we were going about it wasn't really changing. So again, rather than making this a 10-hour lesson, I figured, we'd speed up some of the repetitive pieces and make it probably closer to a 3-hour lesson. Now here I'm working in the body, the bottom areas of our trees, and we're just going to apply quite a lot of thick pigment. We're going to make it slightly darker than our previous application. That way the trees progressively get darker as you move farther down, which makes sense because the tops of the trees will receive more light. As you get farther down, the other trees will cast shadows on their brother trees, right? And we just want to ensure that we do have that slow progress of even the darker values getting darker as you move towards the base. Though while this looks quite dark, I would like to note that it isn't a pure Mars black. We still do have the ultramarine blue. We still do have a little bit of titanium white, and it's coming together to create a really nice pigment. I'm also softly blending it up some of the trees. That way, again, we do get that nice gradient. You can go for a soft blend, you can go for a tap. Just make sure that there isn't a hard edge between the previously applied dark application and this one. You also might want to do this a couple of times just so you get a nice thick base layer, and here I'm just softening things with a very quick stroke. Now we're going to grab our filbert brush, and as you can see, it has a fairly large body, but the edges aren't sharp, so it can be great for blending. With that, we grab some green gold for the first time, about an equal mixture of Mars black, a hint of a titanium white to desaturate it and brighten it just a hint, and upon testing that on the reference photo, I realized that it does need to be darker. So we go in with a little bit of additional Mars black. I realized that, it needs to be a cooler green, so we add some blue into there as well. That blue is darkening the mixture slightly, and upon applying that, I realized that is what we want. So I mix up a bit more and we head into the canvas. This is the foliage, which again is going to have quite a bit of snow on it, but we need to build that base layer. Now, I generally go in initially by applying this highlight to the tops of all of the noticeably protruding branches. That way it looks like the light is coming down, it's catching the top of all of the foliage, it's getting this nice green. It's a fairly subtle green, by the way. We do want it to be relatively desaturated. And then the bottom branches, the other areas behind, are a bit darker. So we're creating a bit of early depth. Again, the majority of this is going to be painted over with the snow and the lighter grays, but this is going to have an impact later on, if not at least subtly. So I'm quite happy with this. We are just doing these rotated taps. You can tell that the individual little bristles are creating this nice little texture, this nice little effect to this, and all of your brushes are going to have some variance in them, so we'll get a slightly different technique here, but I really like that. I feel like it's a little bit of detail, but it's not too much, and it definitely strikes the right amount. Now, this, again, does take quite some time, so I'm going to speed up portions of it, but when we get to new information, I will slow down. Here, though, we are just working in the body. I'm trying to leave a lot of open spaces. That way it looks like the branches aren't too tight, too close together, and it obviously gets darker in the background because the more deep you go into these sets of trees, the less light that can kind of get to those areas. So the protruding areas, like what we're doing right now, catch the most light, and then the darker backgrounds are the areas that just don't have much at all, especially because this foliage is going to be so thick with all of the snow on top it. Light just can't work through it in the same way it would in a different season. So the middle of your trees can typically be a bit darker when working in the winter season, and that's just, again, another subtle little tip you can work into your pieces. With that, here we are getting back to a bit more of that quick footage, and you're going to want to press with less pressure on the smaller trees. That way you get the smaller markings. When we get to the trees in the foreground, we obviously do more pressure, and it's worth noting that we are overlapping some of them. Don't worry about it getting too messy. Just try to keep with the general flows of the branches. But here we have a bit of a distant shot. You can see all of the trees. Definitely a lot to do, but I think it's great for a base layer, and now we have an idea of where we're going to put our snow. Once all of that dries, we're going to head back to our palette and grab quite a bit of our ultramarine blue using that same filbert brush. We'll grab some of our titanium white. I tried to be quite selective there, didn't want to grab a portion that was diluted with the green, and then we grab about an equal mixture of Mars Black to the blue that we had. From there, I do want to brighten it up a little bit, so we add in some extra titanium white. We test that onto the fallen snow, and that looks great. However, I do want it to be slightly brighter, and we can build on this over multiple layers, but here we're going back in and you can barely tell the difference. So we're going to work with this. Again, I would like to reiterate, you do want to ensure that your greens are fully dry. You don't want this to be mixing. You don't want it to be diluted by the greens. And if the greens are fully dry, you won't have an issue at all. So here I'm going and finding the tops of all of those green applications and tapping it on in the same way we did our previous layer. However, I'm, again, trying to use less pressure so that small portions of that green do show underneath. I don't want it to show through. I want these layers to be nice and thick, but I do want hints of that green in the painting. And you don't have to cover every branch. If you feel like a certain branch is going to be more inset, then let that one remain green because the snow probably couldn't have fallen onto it, right? So that'll generally happen with these slightly smaller branches, the ones that are a little bit darker, because it is more inset, it's not going to get that same amount of light, and those are generally rendered when you apply paint, but you don't have a lot of paint on your brush, so you get a semi-transparent application. Here, by the way, I'm going in and I'm trying to work on the edges of this tree. That way I know where it basically is. I have its shape, I have the form mapped in, and then I can do the ones around it while keeping it in mind so that I don't kind of overcomplicate these areas. And that's why we had a little bit more free reign with our green, because we were going to come in and really clean things up here with the snow. We were really going to differentiate our trees in a number of places. And so here is really where we take all of the information that we gathered from the green applications and put it into use. Exactly where those branches are, where those trees are. This is a much more stark contrast, so it's much more noticeable. And again, it was great to just have that practice round beforehand. So here we're getting back to a little bit more of that speed painting, and we are working on a slightly more distant couple of trees here, so less pressure. You can tell that these strokes are more thin, though we are going to thicken some of them, connect some of them in the foreground. That way it looks like the foliage is a bit larger, it's collecting more snow, and it definitely can help add shape and form if you feel like you're losing trees within the larger clusters. So different things to consider. I also go up to the tops of the trees and really fill those out. The brighter you get the tops of the trees, the more reflective light it looks like there is, and you can really create some beautiful depth. Earlier, we did try to make the bottom base of the trees a lot darker, and we can continue that general idea by making the tops of the trees, or the highlights, even brighter. So I'm drawing quite a bit here to kind of continue that idea with the depth in our trees. And these are all very subtle things. They're not things that someone will initially notice when they look at the painting, but they're all elements that build in that realism that you really do want. So with that, I think things are going really quite well. We are going to go in and break up portions of these highlights a little bit later on as well. So if you tend to overdo it, don't worry about it. And something I actually do here is purposefully overdo portions. That way I have more option when I'm breaking it up and I can create a bit more detail. We are on the foreground. We're not scared of detail, kind of like we were with those background trees. We are at a point where we can really start investing in detail, and that's what I do. So here I'm just reshaping a couple of my trees, really, my branches, by making certain areas brighter and more full than others. But again, we can walk all of this back in a little bit. So far, so good though. If you find any of your applications are a little bit thin, I would recommend just kind of waiting for it to dry, going back in, doing a second layer, and you can also go in with a slightly highlighted layer on the very edges of your branches, and that's going to create a lot of depth as well. So I really like how this is looking, and it's time for the next step. So it's time to jump into some detail, and we're going to do so with a liner brush. This one's a little bit bigger than the last, though still quite small, and we're going to grab quite a bit of our titanium white, a little bit of our ultramarine blue, and with this we can add some highlights to the base of our protruding little areas of foliage. And these, as you can see, wander out from the larger cluster for the most part, and we're going to add quite a bit of it, admittedly, though once it gets to a point where it's too detailed, we're going to work reductively. So here, really just look for those ending areas, or if you feel like you've accidentally created blocks of highlight, then this is your chance to make sure that each little piece is unique and that it has its own little pieces that are kind of connected and working off of it. So these go generally in the same direction as the original branch, but they do also kind of veer off in their own directions. They definitely act as leading lines, and they also allow the eye to follow the edges of the tree, which can again be important when you have 10 or 12 trees all lined up beside each other. Definitely gives us a way of organizing yet again when things get a little complex. And it's kind of ironic because we're adding more paint to differentiate the mass amount of paint that we already have on there, but it works quite well. I'd also like to note that as we get towards the tops of the trees, I'm not just applying it to the very ends of the branches, but the entirety of them, because at the top, the whole area of that snow is going to be receiving light, whereas you get down farther towards the middle and bottom, we need to do less of it and just put it at the ends, because half of that branch is covered by a shadow of the branch above it. After that, I do grab some of our darker pigments, very close to the mixture that we used for the middle of the tree, and now I'm going to work reductively. We're going to start taking away from those highlights, finding, again, larger blocky areas and breaking them down. So if you feel like anything's become too consistent, perhaps you kind of fell subconsciously into a particular pattern, or that the filbert brush just wasn't giving you enough variance, this is a way of taking things out as opposed to adding things in. So 2 different ways of going about adding detail. I'd personally recommend doing both, and when you've done this, you may find that you've taken out too much. You can go back to the highlights and do that all over again. So here, a lot of separation is starting to occur. We had a lot of beautiful areas that I just felt looked too full, and now we're just separating. And I think that this is where it really starts to look great and come together. So I'm starting with a very soft touch, that way we get a fairly sharp application where it's breaking apart, and then I press in with my brush, it expands, and then we kind of get to fill out that area and render something very similar to the middle of the tree. So far so good. I am going to do the majority of it on the larger trees, and then the smaller ones will do a little bit less. So now that our trees are complete, we can have some fun with the roof of our cabin here. We're grabbing a lot of titanium white, a little bit of that Mars black, and right now we're really looking for the darkest pigment in that roof. Much like the trees, we're starting with the darker base layers, we're adding on our midtones, we're adding on our highlights. So I'm continuously testing this back and forth, looking between all of the shingles, all of the snow, just finding those darker little areas. And once we have that, I'm also going to test it down on the steps and other similar subjects that we have in our reference photo, because we can paint multiple of them at the same time and add their very specific unique colors and features later. So I'm starting off with figuring out exactly where our line work is going to be, where all of our definitive structures are going to start and end. because while we drew it in, we covered quite a bit of it with our paint, right? So we're just reassigning those. You could do that with Conte, but you can do it very strategically with paint, as I'm doing here. Again, if you find the drawing process for this structure a little difficult, we do have the traceable up over on Patreon, where you can also get the reference photo printed off and test your colors like I've been doing throughout this lesson. It's also just a great way to say thank you and support the channel. So if you're interested in that, there is a link in the description. But with that, I am just adding more and more paint. I really don't want to create thin layers, especially here. This is our main subject. This is where the attention is going to go in the painting, and we just want to make sure that we're not making all of those little shortcuts, especially here. So I'm going in, I'm trying to apply a fair amount of paint, but if I feel like I'm running out of paint, I go back to my palette, I mix more, and my brush is quite damp right now so that I can get those very fine, sharp applications. But if I find it gets too damp and I just can't apply paint, I let it dry fully, and then I come back 5-10 minutes later when I can apply paint properly. Though I know that working with water can be a little tricky, and I just wanted to reaffirm the reason we're doing that here is when you apply water to your brush, your bristles condense. They get more close together, they stay together so you don't have stray little bristles, and therefore you can get these very sharp, very finite markings, which are so great for these human-made structures, right? Things that have very definitive sharp edges. With our trees, we could have all of those movements kind of organically working. They were rough, they were bending. Here, we want things that are much more controlled. And this brush, especially when wet, is fantastic for it. So here we are just using the 1/2-inch flat-headed brush. If you feel like you'd like to just apply more paint at once, you can move to the 1-inch flat-headed brush. I know some people are opting to work on a larger canvas with this piece specifically because it is so detailed, and I think that's actually a great idea. You definitely have a lot to work with here, so if you'd like to invest the time, that's definitely an option. Here we're going in and we're working on the roof with a slightly brighter gray than what we worked with previous. Now, it still is slightly blue, and all of our grays will be throughout this lesson, just because we are always going to have a little bit of that cool light reflecting onto our subjects, that will also have a lot of warm light emanating from this building, and that's going to look so fantastic. Blue and orange are complementary colors. We'll talk about it more in the lesson, but they make each other pop, and we're going to have a lot of them in this piece, really helping each other out. So I get that in there. I decide to work on our little stone pathway that we have down at the bottom of the house, the stairs, and with that, we can move on to the next step. So now that our roof is fully dry, we're going to create some snow to place on top of it. We're doing so with the 1/2-inch flat-headed brush, quite a bit of titanium white, about an equal mixture of ultramarine blue, hint of Mars black, and as per usual, I do mix it to be a little bit darker than it needs to be. So we add some extra titanium white, I do a test, and yet again, slightly too dark. So I grab more titanium white and I start a new mixture, this time slightly off to the side, that way I can grab some of the initial paint that we used, but add more titanium white. And I do this so that we don't have to use an overabundance of titanium white. If we wanted to mix with that initial application, then we have to use significantly more because we have a lot more dark paint to work with. So by just taking a little bit of that darker paint off to the side, you can ensure that you don't have to use as much paint, correcting what is or initially was a significantly darker pigment. With that, I am working with the smaller liner brush here, and we're beginning with the snow on the top of the roof, then slowly working our way down. I'm also going to show you right now how I go about working on the shingles. Generally, it starts with a fairly horizontal line, though it isn't going to be perfectly horizontal. It's going to be in the general direction of whichever protruding piece of the roof we are working on, and this one sticks out from the house with a little bit of an angle, so we're also interjecting that angle into those lines. But with that, I am now starting to move down here and separate this part of the roof from the other. Using snow, it'll kind of fall into that crease, right? and then at the bottom it'll spread out a little bit. Now I'm going to jump over to the right hand side, and it's important to recognize that the bottom of the snow, the body of the snow, it's going to be significantly more opaque. And then as I move upwards, as you can see right here, it starts to get more thin. That's purposeful, and I want to do that so it looks like the snow is essentially sprinkled more so at the top, and then it's falling down, it's collecting, it's accumulating, and it's creating something that is, again, more opaque. So this is a scenario where you probably want to make sure that your brush is a little bit damp so that you can thin that paint out and render that gradient, but I really like the way that looks, and I think it's a fairly good general rule. With that, I'm now going to head up and start working on some of the other details that we have in the roof. And it's a fairly interesting roof. I really liked it from a design standpoint, though I would like to note, I will be taking artistic liberties with the building itself. And it's one of those things where we all have aesthetic preferences, and I definitely wanted to tweak little things, change little things. You're more than welcome to do the same, but I did base the traceable off of the original reference photo. So if you want all of the details, you want the perspective exactly as it is in the photo, truly correct, you are more than welcome to work with that. But you're also more than welcome to have fun with it, create little additions, take pieces apart, really just have fun with it and make it your own. That's something I try to talk about in all of these lessons, and it seems like a good point to do that right here. So with that, here I'm going in with a fairly watery liner brush, creating those horizontal strokes. You can see that I'm trying to apply as little pressure as I can with my brush, and in a lot of scenarios that means that I'm actually not getting paint to come off of the brush and land on the canvas. So recognize that that is technically an issue you can have, but it really isn't an issue. It's something that can be remedied by just going over it a couple of times. Just a bit of patience will get you there, and I think that it's definitely the right route because you do want those lines to be smaller. Earlier, I mentioned that a number of people were going to do this on a larger canvas, and the larger the canvas you have, the easier and probably the more aesthetic your roof will end up being. So just something to consider there. The larger the canvas, the longer it'll take to do the painting, but the more detail you'll be able to accurately portray, especially in the foreground. Now, with that, here you can see that I am going back over a number of areas again. Layering is so important, and here I'm going in with those fairly vertical applications, just breaking apart all of the shingles. And hypothetically, here we have the snow. It's kind of working its way in between a lot of them, kind of maybe getting stuck at the bottom. It's doing a lot of different things, and I think that for that reason it's as visually captivating as it is. So I'm trying to create something that is ever changing, despite the fact that, again, it is human made. It's an organic substance on top of the roof, and so I think we have some additional room to play. Now, I started with a smaller number of those vertical lines, and then as you can see, I went back in and I worked in more. That's generally how I like to work with this. That way we didn't kind of make it overly detailed at that point, and then I could kind of just slowly build, slowly add as I saw fit. Here I'm working with more of them over on the right hand side, and we do have that drop down little area as well, which we're about to get into. So a lot of different portions to have fun with, though again, you are more than welcome to simplify it. You are more than welcome to make it more complicated. And again, the traceable is directly worked off of the reference photo, so if you want it perfect, you can do that as well. But here, following those same general rules, we have the snow on the top of the roof. We are working on our horizontal lines here, trying to press as softly as possible into that canvas and just create something initially that's a little bit more subtle, a little bit more barren detail-wise, but something we can build on. So there's quite a bit of repetition in the roof area, but I love that because it teaches you how to do it, it reinforces those ideas, and repetition in painting really isn't a bad thing because each time you probably learn something, you have more time to sit with the subject to really understand it, and I think that this is a really fun one to work on. So here, just going back, adding that extra detail, working in some of those vertical lines. I'm trying to show you it up close and far away because this is how you'd actually see it in a room, but I also wanted the close-up shots so that you could see how we were going about the detail. And this lesson will really be comprised of both of those, as are most of my lessons, just because I think it's the best way to learn and to recognize what your painting will look like from all of these different distances. But with that, I think it's time for the next step. Now we're going to have some fun by creating a very small stone wall. And we're going to begin with quite a bit of our burnt umber, a hint of our cadmium red light hue, and then some cadmium yellow deep hue. After that, I grab the smallest hint of Mars black and about an equal mixture of titanium white. Then we go back in for some additional titanium white, and the goal here is going to be to render a couple of different warm browns for our stone. So I take some of that mixture, move it off to the side. This time I add more red to it. I then add a new mixture to the palette, this time working with the more red mixture, some extra white, and some extra yellow. So we already have quite a lot of variance, and each time I do this, I'm just working from the last mixture and trying to make it a little bit more interesting, a little bit different. So here we go for more of an orange than we've achieved in the past, so a bit of that extra red. I'm testing it on the palette and just, trying to make sure that we are on the right track. But with that, I definitely want something a bit brighter. So here we're working with more of that titanium white. We have quite a few options. We have the liner brush, and we're going to go in and start tapping all of these onto the canvas. Now, I'm going to initially do this and try to keep them fairly spread out, as that's definitely going to make it look better in the end. We want it to look randomized, we want to incorporate different colors, we want that variance, and we also want these applications to be relatively thick. So it's definitely beneficial to have your brush damp so that the bristle is condensed for this portion, but you don't want it too damp because you still want your pigment to be fairly opaque. You can always go over it with a secondary layer and continue to work on it, but recognize that we do want to ensure that we have some nice thick applications here. Now I'm going in with more of an orangey yellow, again dancing around all of the previous applications, and just with two colors here, I think it's already starting to look quite nice. So the added variance is definitely a good play, especially in a landscape like this where we have very limited colors. Thus far, we've only worked with titanium white, Mars black, ultramarine blue, and our golden green. Now we're working with browns, yellows, oranges, reds, and it's definitely going to add to the piece. So once I get a good amount down in the bottom area, I do start to work up our chimney area here too, again leaving spots in between. And a lot of these applications aren't simply just taps. It's a tap and then a slight drag to the left or the right. That way it's a little bit elongated and each of the bricks does look horizontal. So just one more thing to consider. Now we're going in with a slightly different color. It's a bit more of a gray, and I think that it looks really quite nice. Filling out the bottom area yet again. I didn't want to do too much initially because I didn't want to kind of overdo the left hand side, overdo the right hand side, overdo the middle, and then feel like I had to overdo everything else. So we just kind of tried to do as much as we felt was absolutely necessary. And then here, over the next 20 or so minutes, I filled in the rest with all of these. I did opt for some brighter applications, and while it may look a little awkward right now because our background's fairly muted and dark, once we start adding the light to all of the wood in the actual cabin, it's going to look really fantastic. So this is where we're just trusting that process, trusting the reference photo. And here I'm even creating new mixes as we go. A lot of those colors did dry in the process, and that's really just something that's going to happen with acrylic paints. Nothing to worry about, but it definitely did give us the opportunity to create some new mixes that I think ended up working really, really wonderfully. Here I'm also creating some dimension in that chimney, just kind of breaking it down into its three-dimensional shapes on the edges and filling in some areas as well. But so far so good, and we will go back in and add additional warmth to it a little bit later on in the lesson. So we've just finished creating quite a bit of detail, and this next step is a little bit more easy. So we're going to take quite a bit of our Mars black, a little bit of that titanium white, though we do want to keep this relatively dark, and we're going to block in the middle portions of our windows for the house here. And as you can see, I'm just going in with a little bit of a tap and drag effect, trying to keep all of my edges relatively sharp. However, we're going to be painting the actual wood of the log cabin around it, so it really isn't a big issue if we kind of extend things a little bit too far. What I would advise is making things slightly larger than they should be. That way you have a little bit of room to overlap when you go in with the browns. I'm also going to use this for the window, which will hypothetically be right around our door, and with that we are back to our palette. So here I'm grabbing quite a bit of our burnt umber, about an equal mixture of titanium white, small hint of Mars black. You can see that I'm wiping off the excess on the canvas, and then we're actually going to warm it up with some of our cadmium red medium hue and a small hint of our cadmium yellow deep hue, though we definitely want more of the red than the yellow, because if we have a lot of yellow and Mars black in our mixture, they tend to mix to make a green, and the red is going to stop that from happening. So that's essentially what we were doing there. We achieved a fairly nice warm brown. We're going to start working on a second one here, and you will notice that throughout this lesson I am kind of creating multiple warm colors at once. That way we can kind of interject them and just get a good feel for how it's all going to work together. But right now I want that really nice dark pigment for the top, the shadowy areas, the base layer of a lot of this wood, and here you can see that's exactly where we're starting with this. We're just trying to fill in that area. I'm cutting around the edges first, because when you have new paint on your brush, it's the most damp. You have the best opportunity to create very sharp, accurate lines. So I do that, and then when I start to run out of paint, I generally tend to work in the body of subjects. But here you can see that we're just working around all of those edges, and this brush is absolutely fantastic for it. It is the right size, it is the right shape, it's really, really wonderful. And again, this is just the 1/2 inch flat-headed brush. Now here I do go back to my palette, grab some more paint, and I do make it a little bit damp in that process as well, just because that is going to condense those bristles and allow us to really get a clean application. It will mean that some of these are a little bit thin, but you can always go back in, do a second layer. And if you find it difficult to add a second layer, do try to just let your painting dry for a little bit first, and it'll make it a whole lot easier. Here we're working off over to the right hand side as well, and the darker base layer is quite dark. It's almost difficult to tell the difference between the windows and it, but I think that it really paid off, and it's exactly what we need right now to build on top of. I'm also going to start creating a couple of the supporting beams right around here. This is going to go on top of our chimney. It's going to go kind of out over portions of the trees, and it's definitely going to add a lot of dimension and detail to the piece. So far, so good. So now that we've had our fun with a bit of a more easy section, we're going to dive into some details, and we're going to start by mixing up a really nice bright warm pigment here, using quite a lot of our cadmium red medium hue, a little bit of the cadmium yellow deep hue, bit of our burnt umber, and now quite a bit of our titanium white as well. Here you can see that I'm testing it as per usual, far too dark. So we go back, we grab some extra titanium white. Every time we do that, you'll notice that it does desaturate the pigment a little bit. So here I'm trying to find that right compromise, add in some of the yellow and red to give it that saturation back. I feel like it's getting there, but I do feel like I want it to be a bit more red, a bit more orange. So we work with some additional red initially there. At least I felt like it got a little peachy, so we added more yellow, and it's really a back and forth. And this right here, I think, is a really wonderful color, though, yet again, could be slightly more red, and this right here is exactly what I wanted. So, with that, we are going to switch to our liner brush, and we're going to have fun crafting the light. Now, all of this is going to be emitting from a light which is outside. However, we're going to work on that a little bit later. The light, however, is going to be exactly where I started the initial application here, and now I'm working that light to both the left and the right hand side. Ideally, we have that middle section to be quite opaque, as you can see, and then as you move to the left and the right, it starts to dissipate. You can see that darker base layer show through, and at this point we do want that darker base layer to be fully dry because it did have quite a bit of Mars black in it, and we wouldn't want that mixing with all of the cadmium yellow deep hue that we worked with in this mixture. So here, again, working around that window, moving to the left, moving to the right, allowing the paint to dissipate, and also peeling our brush off the canvas. That way we end on a bit of a sharper mark, a sharper application. We are pressing in a bit more when we are close to that window, and that's the general idea. Now we can go a bit farther out with a very soft touch, and this is actually going to be quite similar to how we approached the roof, in that we want it to be as subtle as possible. It's a lot of horizontal marks, and the farther we get from that central area, the more you're going to maybe want to water down your brush a little bit so it's more transparent. The more you're going to want to apply lightly, the more you're going to want that paint to just run out. And that's really what I tried to achieve as we moved up there. Though admittedly right now it does look a little bit rough. So I do just grab some water on my brush and I start blending all of this. That way it's a bit less granular. You can't see the tooth of the canvas to that great degree. And the tooth of the canvas is quite interesting. It's something you're going to want in some subjects, but not others. So recognize that it isn't always a good thing and it's not always a bad thing. It, like so many others, is a tool, right? It's something you can incorporate and implement to heighten certain areas, but it will detract from others. So it's really up to you and when you want to incorporate it. I generally like it in things like rocks. I think that it looks quite good with the snow up in the roof. However, here in the wood, I didn't love it. Though, ironically, with wood very close up, I love it as texture. So just, again, think about the very specific scenario, how far away your subject is, and where you might want to incorporate that. With that said, here we're now going to add some highlights to the wood that we have over on the right-hand side of the house, trying to create fairly straight lines here vertically. And initially, when I was crafting the trees, you notice that I was doing a bit of a tap effect with the flat-headed brush because I was okay with it looking a little off, a little organic. Here, I am actively trying to make it look a bit more straight. And they definitely could use work, but we will have opportunities to put that work in as we continue to add layers because, as you can see right now, it is far from opaque and we definitely need to add more. So here now, we're moving down and we're starting to work on some of the more minor details. At this point, we've been working on more of the structurally impacting highlights, but there also are little protruding areas at the bottom that are going to catch some light. It's a different shape, and it's a non-organic shape, so again, it works within the context of this log cabin. So it's a really neat piece. You have all of these very natural applications that are occurring around it, and then you have all of these very structural normal shapes occurring kind of in the center, and I love that balance. I love how it really does draw the eye in, and the more layers that we add with the highlight, the more we're just going to continue to get that effect. So here I'm being fairly careful of not adding too much highlight to the wall right there, and I do decide to kind of change how this all protrudes a little bit later, but right now I do want to solidify the areas that I know I love. So here we're going back in with more of that nice highlight. We're just thickening it, and I'm not necessarily applying any more pressure than I was initially. It's just that the pigment is now starting to build up, and because of that it's becoming more opaque. It looks more thick, though we really aren't, again, intentionally making it anymore, so because I want those fairly small lines. I want those great details. And when you're working on a canvas this size, again 9 by 12, you are relatively limited in how much detail you can incorporate in any given area, just because there isn't that much space and there's quite a bit of the canvas grit. So just different things to consider. Here we're now moving over to the left hand side where I'm going to add some highlight to the beams. It should be for the most part on the right hand side of the beam because that's where the light is coming from, though admittedly I did do that on the opposite side on the left hand one. So something to go back and fix a little bit later. I was just kind of trying to figure things out. We have a connective piece up here that's kind of touching both sides of the roof, and that does move into both of our other poles right here too. So I'll have to go back in and add a shadow for the one that's kind of overlapping portions of the structure, and here we'll have another one. So slowly adding, just looking at the reference photo, making sure we're moving in that correct direction, going back, doing a secondary layers to really build that up. And again, I'd like to note that you should take your time. You should have fun with it. Don't get too stressed out about all of the minute details. It is acrylic paints, and acrylics are wonderful because they are forgiving. If you mess something up, it is no worries at all. All you have to do is wait 5-10 minutes, let it dry, cover it up, and start again. Generally through that, you end up learning a very valuable lesson, which you can then take into all of your future paintings, making it not a bad thing at all. So yeah, Bob Ross always said it was a happy accident, right? And I think that's a wonderful way to think about it. So here we are grabbing some of that cadmium yellow deep hue, some of our cadmium red medium hue, some titanium white, again remixing because the paint does dry on our palette and I do want something a little bit brighter this time. So we are going to slowly build here. We're working a bit of that red into it, and now we'll go back to the areas that I think will receive the most amount of highlight and we'll apply it. So this is going to happen on all of our beams right here, and it's also going to happen inside of the wood a little bit, not actually inside, but kind of in that central area. We do want this to be emitting, so we will go back to this a couple of times. Right now I'm just taking a couple of steps back, looking at the painting, making sure that we are on the right track, and that's something we haven't talked about yet in this lesson, but I think is very important. Make sure that you're not getting too close and hyper focused on any specific area. Make sure that every 5-10 minutes you're taking steps back to ensure that everything is cohesive, it's working together, because it's very easy to make one really great area but have it not fit in with everything else. And we are working on a lot of detail right now, so this is where it really matters. So just make sure that you are trying to keep that wide perspective while working on all of these tiny intricate pieces. Now over to the right hand side, I'm going in with a bit of a warmer orange this time, just trying to create a bit of diversity. Sometimes your lights are going to be different, they're going to have a slightly different hue, and therefore the glow is also going to be altered. So just different things to consider. Now I'm going to create some very finite details in the windows. We're going to create all of these little pieces that connect them together, and here I'm starting to run out of paint. I definitely recommend wetting your brush, going back, grabbing more paint as I am right here when you see that happening, because you really don't want to have to press any harder. The harder you press, the larger your stroke's going to be, and here we want them to be extremely small. So going in with a very watery brush, as little pressure as possible. Here it's getting a little rough, and I do think I should have went back to my palette, but we are able to get a couple more, and the variance honestly doesn't look bad. I think that it does still look quite nice. So with that, we're now going to create a dividing piece in the middle of all of them as well. Same technique, same amount of pressure. Here I'm going over it a couple of times though, just to make sure it's as straight as it can be. And if you find you're really having issues, you can use a ruler or something of that nature. You could use painter's tape to put on the canvas. But I'm fairly confident that we're going to get it to look quite good. So I'm just freehanding it here. Something else you can do, by the way, you can just use your pinky finger, place it on the canvas to ground it, eliminate some of the shake from your hand, and that should also help. I tend to do that when I kind of forget to have a little bit to drink. I forget to kind of have my snacks in between the painting process. I don't know about you, but I can definitely start a painting, get lost in it, and just realize that it's been 10 hours. So if you're like me and that happens, make sure that you are maybe setting a little alarm and making sure that you are staying hydrated, that you're eating. Generally, if you don't do that sort of thing, A, it's not healthy, but B, you can get a little bit shaky, and that does hinder the painting. So just make sure that you are taking care of yourself through the process. Here I'm getting some of that brighter pigment, more leaning towards the yellow and the titanium white. This is where the light is actually going to be, and now we're really going to start building that out with a lot of detail. Every time we add a layer, we get slightly brighter, and we inch it slightly more towards the titanium white and the cadmium yellow, leaving behind the red in the mix. Though the red was great because it acts as a really nice, warm, rich base layer that can still be seen through a lot of these applications. Here I'm adding on some of the highlights to the beams, but only in the middle of the beam at essentially the level of the light, and then I try to have it dissipate as it moves up and down, with the middle area being the most opaque. So lots of little techniques that are occurring in there, and that's really what this section is going to be all about. I'm going to create a little crevice there, essentially where the door would open. There isn't any light in that area because it just can't move its way into that crevice. It's a nice additional little detail we can work in. And now we're going to go with a bit of a darker pigment, and I'm going to map out where I want my stairs to be. So here you can see that the bottom stair is the widest, and then it'll progressively get smaller as we move upwards. I'm also going to use this color to clean up a couple of the edges. We can also use it to implement additional windows, additional doors. Again, while I had a sketch, while I had the reference photo, while I had the traceable, I also had my own innate preferences, and I did start to kind of play with things a little bit too. So here we're also adding a little lip to the top here, and that's something that we can cover with snow. Again, it's just additional dimension. It's a nice little detail. I think it adds to the realism, and that's what the end of this step really is. It's all of these tiny little things we can do to increase the painting detail wise, and this is the area where you really do want the detail. We talked about being quite careful with it previously, but this is where we want the viewer's attention, and this is where we can really dive in. Here we're grabbing a very minute amount of snow, same value, same color that we used up on the top of the roof, and I'm just kind of moving along the top edges anywhere I feel like it would fall, but it's not a consistent amount. I did try to vary it throughout the lines, that way some areas were a little bit more packed than others, and I think that it actually turned out really wonderfully. We're also going to go up to the top and just touch up some of the other snow. Now that we're incorporating in other areas, we have a better idea of how much we actually want in that area, and often I find with a lot of painters, myself included, the paintings come together in the final 10 to 15% because everything is almost finished, and then in that final little push, you fix and you touch up everything. You make it cohesive, you bring it together, and that is what we just did. A very light, a very small example of that. Just saying, okay, we have the snow there, so we can go back and we can touch up the snow over there as well. Here we're adding it to a couple of ledges and just really building on, again, the cohesive nature of this. We have a bit of a crevice in the stone wall, so I'm adding some snow here, and I do go back and kind of touch things up, add some extra layers as we do with every step. But I think it's really starting to come together, and the last 10 minutes very specifically really brought it home. I ensured that we didn't speed up any of this part of the process because I felt like it was all different. I felt like we were consistently changing things. We were consistently taking in new information, and I hope you were okay with the longer kind of section here, because I do think it was beneficial in quite a few ways. But here I'm going in with that snow, and we're going to add it just to the tops of a couple of these stairs, beautiful detail, beautiful contrast. You can incorporate some very stark contrasts here, by the way, because again, it is in the foreground, it is the main subject, it's not all that far away, and I just think that this is where we really want to put that attention. So now we're going to create a little bit of our smoke coming from the top of the fireplace. I'm going in with a very watery titanium white, going to try to make the edges as soft and blended as I can, and something semi-transparent just like that. Now, while we will want to go back a little bit later and work on that cabin, it's time to move on in the painting, and we're going to do so with the 1/2-inch flat-headed brush, about an even mixture of our Mars Black and Burnt Umber, just a hint of titanium white, and a little bit of our cadmium red medium hue as well. And this is essentially going to be the pigment for the landmass underneath, which we are going to cover with quite a bit of snow. But as you can see, we are just going to start by working on that top edge, because really it is best to get those sharper applications done first, and then again we can fill in the body. Now, I did want to mention that there's going to be quite a lot of painting in this section, but not a lot that's really changing or differing. So I did decide to speed up a little bit of this. We're going to bring it over into the right hand side and blend it up into the trees. The closer the blend, the more soft of a blend you can get there, the better it will look. But once I have that down and I'm letting it dry, I move back over to my palette. We grab quite a bit of titanium white, a little bit of that ultramarine blue. You can see I'm going back a couple of times and just slowly adding more. Then we do a test on our reference photo. For the first time, it's not actually too dark. So that's really nice to see. I do want it to be slightly cooler, so we add just a hint of our blue, and we also add some Mars Black. Again, kind of funny to be working in the other direction considering how the rest of the painting's been going. But with that, the base layer has now fully dried, and you do want to ensure that that base layer does fully dry before you move on to this section. But here I'm starting at the top, creating this larger mound of snow that we are, essentially walking up to when we go to this log cabin. And I'm trying to get a fairly interesting look. It's not perfectly straight. You have all of these little areas that kind of dip down, and it's actually one of the few areas in the painting where we're actually trying to apply a bit of pressure. That way we do expand those bristles, we do get a larger application. And as long as when you do that, you're not spreading out the paint to the point where it's getting thin, it can actually render a really nice effect here. It'll look like this thick snow that sits on top, and I think that it actually worked out really well. From there, we do use the corner of the brush, and I just start to bring down these little protruding areas that are going to have snow accumulate on top of them. And this is going to be something that we move down throughout a longer process here, but we're starting it off with this brush. I'm also going to use some of this paint to mark the base of our snow. Again, the log cabin, it's up with a little bit of height, and we do want to show that height. So here I'm just working on the bottom ground-esque area, and we are going to work that over to the right hand side as well. I'm trying to ensure that my top line is also quite sharp, because we're not really going to do too much over that area, and I want it to look nice and clean. You can have a little bit of that grit, but for the most part I do want something that's a bit more sharp. Now here we do have kind of a marking where we can kind of blend back all of the snow that we have, and we're going to want our brush to be a little bit more damp, so I did take off the remaining paint. We're going back in and we're just letting it dissipate as it moves into the distance, and then we go back to some finger painting, of course, just to add an extra soft effect. If you want, you can also add some of your trees kind of coming down into the snow. I decided not to do that because I didn't want to incorporate that element of scale, but it is an option. Now I'm going to take my smaller liner brush with that same snow color that we have, and I'm going to speed up the first area here because admittedly I was getting a little warmed up and I don't think that the applications were as clean as they could be, but around the middle area I do really figure out how I want to go in with this technique, and I figured we'd take the time to show you once it's actually proper, and that time is now. So what I'm doing here is I'm essentially creating, again, snow on top of all of the protruding areas that snow can essentially fall on, and that's going to look like a couple of clumps, and it's going to fall into another clump, and it's going to fall into another clump. So we're doing a lot of these arched applications, and I want them to be fairly clean. Something I had issue with in my first attempt, which you can see right above where I'm currently working, is that a lot of it's semi-transparent. It's not really comprised of the sharper applications, and it just looks a little bit messy. So here I recommend going in with fairly thick paint. You'll see me go back to the palette just so many times for this. I do have my brush a little bit damp to help us ensure that the lines are fairly sharp, but I'm not adding so much to the point where, again, it is semi-transparent, though you can always go back and add more layers. With that, I'm also going to start moving out to the left and the right hand side. Here you can see I'm just trying to find all of these little lanes, and these markings are almost never perfectly vertical or horizontal. They kind of move down like very organic stairs and then connect to one another on varying sides. And the idea is that eventually we're going to find the tops of these rocks, presumably, right? This earth, and we're going to make the areas where the snow is really falling and pooling on a bit more bright, and it'll look like something you can walk up when we're done. Right now, again, a little bit messy, but here you can see I do decide to combine some of those areas, bring them together right there, and with that we're going to speed things up because this was a very timely process. But I'm starting to look for areas that have these larger openings and starting to connect them. We're going over that darker base layer. We're creating what is essentially an organic looking step. And it's really just this continuation of these arching applications that move downward with a bit of a round motion, but also one that's consistently changing. It has bumps in it. It's not perfect. And then wherever, again, we feel that the land is wider, wherever it can really accumulate snow, we fill in that area and make it significantly more whitish gray. So far so good. I do really like how this started to turn around after we got through that slightly rough start. Though remember, if that happens, don't worry about it. Just let it dry, add on the darker base layer on top, and then come back in and give it another go. But it's a really fun technique once you get the hang of it. It becomes very intuitive, very cathartic, and as you know, I love those portions of paintings. This really did turn into a lot of fun, and it goes to show that the subjects that are initially a little bit difficult for you can end up being some of your favorites, because often through them you end up learning things, you get this sense of pride with them, and it's an exciting process. So just remember, if you're having a hard time with, a specific step here or there, keep at it, try to learn, break it down, figure out what isn't working, and before you know it, I think you'll find yourself in a really good place and excited about your painting and your abilities for future paintings as well. Something that I really try to do in these lessons is not just tell you exactly what I'm doing in the moment, but also why I'm doing it and how we go about it, so that in the future, when you're working on your own paintings, you can interject these ideas, and it's not solely for this individual piece, it's for a wide array of them. And that's why I'm also a little bit repetitive. I know that I personally learn better when I hear things over and over again, and so I do try to repeat to the point where it's useful, and then we kind of speed up the footage after that. But here I'm going in with a bit of a brighter highlight, and again, just finding the areas that are going to be with the most snow, catching the most light, and we're just kind of applying that. Then I do make the brush significantly more wet I blend some edges, that way it looks nice and soft, as snow often does, and it's really, really starting to come together. The brightness of the snow right now is essentially the equivalent to the brightest pigment on the roof, so that those two are cohesive. They are brighter than the trees in the foreground and the background. They're brighter than the mountains, they're brighter than the clouds, and therefore they pop to a greater degree because the eye naturally does go to the areas of the most saturation, the most contrast. And this is definitely the area with the most contrast now. We have the darkest darks, we have the lightest lights, we have them right beside each other, and I think that it's really starting to capture attention. So I'm also going to add some of that highlight down to this bottom area right here, and I am very, very happy with this. But on to the next step. Now, the next portion here is actually quite fun and easy, so we're taking a little bit of a break and just enjoying adding some texture to the rocks that we've implemented. And this is all done through the liner brush and a very simple tapping effect. Sometimes I'm applying more pressure, sometimes applying less pressure, just trying to create some variance in between all of these rocks. And we're going about this because we left the painting with a lot of very large, stark, and flat looking areas. This is going to definitely add some dimension, it's going to add some character, and it's going to visually tie it in with the roof of the cabin, because as you see up there are all of these little markings. The majority of them are done through, vertical and horizontal applications, but the general aesthetic, the values, the hues, it's the same as what we're doing down here, except we're not working with such structural lines, right? It's more of a tap here, a tap there. And when I'm doing it, I'm not always applying the same amount of pressure. I am really trying to vary it so that we get a different marking each time, be it even if it's a subtle change. And I really like that. You can also occasionally use a little bit of a drag in your brush. Normally, it's not going to be a horizontal or vertical application. It'll be diagonal in one way or the other. But we're kind of just dancing around here and trying to figure out exactly how much we want. We're not going all in on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. We are applying a subtle amount to the entirety of it, and then we are building it up as we go. And you can see that I'm really jumping around, a technique that helps us ensure that we don't kind of subconsciously start doing the same thing in one area. Now, this next part is also quite fun. We get to cover a lot of the canvas, and we're using the filbert brush from before. This one is about 1/3 of an inch, but here we are matching the color of the ice, and I think it's worth noting that a reflection is generally slightly darker than what it is reflecting. That goes for the sky, that goes for all of the subjects, and here we are essentially creating a slightly darker sky. I'm mixing it up a couple of times. You can tell that there's a little bit of a gradient happening in the reflection. I don't think I want to make it that complicated because I don't want it to steal attention from the log cabin, but we're going to go for something that really sits in the middle of the brighter and darker areas of that ice. I'm really quite happy with what we have there, and I do mix up a little bit of a darker pigment just in case I do want to play with it, but we are going to jump into this with that brighter application. We're going to try to make sure that it's nice and thick. We're using the filbert brush because it does have a big body, so we can cover a lot of canvas, which is something we need to do with this subject, but also because it has those soft edges, and it's going to ensure that when we are working around our subjects that we're not going to get the sharpest application, which is actually really important here in the reflection. You can paint reflections in a myriad of different ways. You can make them crystal clear, you can add a little bit of a horizontal movement to it if the water is running, you can add a bit of a vertical distortion if you're working with something like ice. And that's what we're going to be doing here today. So we're going to be painting our reflection of the entirety of the top of the painting, but we're going to soften all of it a little bit. We're going to elongate it vertically a little bit, and we're going to make it really, really interesting. But before we do that, we do need to paint in this sky, and here I'm admittedly trying to stretch that paint a little bit farther than I should, so I do end up going back to my palette, grabbing more, and doing a couple of layers. That's something that we did in the sky, that's something we did in the clouds, and it's something we need to continue doing, especially in areas like these. It's also worth noting that for the first little while, the reflection will look a little bit bland. Don't you worry about that. We do end up going back and adding a lot of beautiful texture to it, as you can see in between all of the varying steps. But right now I'm going in with my third or fourth layer at this point, and I am leaving some of those vertical streaks. As you can see, it's not this perfectly clean application, and that's because we do want that vertical stretch effect, which will be much more visually prominent when we actually start working on the cabin, and it'll make a lot more sense. But for now, I'm really, really enjoying this, and again, it's such a fun process. It's something that's so hard to get wrong, and you just kind of get to enjoy the process of painting. So with that, I think it's time for the next step. Now, this next step is also quite fun, and we're going to start with quite a bit of our green gold, about an equal amount of our Mars black, a hint of ultramarine blue, and then a fair amount of titanium white. And this is going to be our first attempt at rendering the darker base layer for our trees in the reflection. Now, I did just note that often the reflection is going to be darker than what it is reflecting. However, that's more so the general rule for skies. When you're working with dark values, often they'll be just a little bit brighter, and you end up with a reflection that looks almost a little bit flat, in that your lights are darker and your darks are lighter. So you're working more with all of these mid values, but that isn't a bad thing, because it means that the eye can focus on the true subjects that you want it to, and the reflection essentially just aids the painting with the composition and makes it very cohesive looking. So with that in mind, we are jumping back into this with the filbert brush, and I'm using it because I do want to be able to carry quite a bit of paint, but I also want the edges of a lot of my applications to be relatively soft, and this brush is going to do that fabulously. Now, I'm starting at quite a distance, and I know it's probably difficult to see the details from here, but I wanted to get a shot with the tree above and the difference in how we're rendering it down below. We will get some close-ups in a second, but with that, I'm essentially marking the middle of the tree. I've gone in and drawn it with a Conte, and now I start with that base. I start to move out from the top, and when I'm doing this, rather than going to the sides, rather than working horizontally and doing that general draping effect that we did with a lot of the branches, here instead I'm working with a lot of vertical strokes and leaving slight openings in between where you're going to have openings in the branches. So we're essentially repainting the trees upside down. However, we're replacing all of our strokes with vertical ones, and I think that it turns out really, really nice from an early stage, which is always really nice, especially with acrylics, considering just so often they require so many layers to actually look great. But this is fantastic. So we have a general idea of where we're painting everything, and now we can get a little bit closer and I can show you those techniques with some real detail. So here I'm going in, I'm doing those vertical applications. I'm skipping some areas, some little portions, so you can see that sky through it, or rather that reflection of the sky. And in these larger open canvas areas, I am using the full head of the brush, where when I'm painting all of the details, I'm really just using half of it, a quarter of it, really small portions. This brush is also not that large. Again, it's about a third of an inch. So we want something that can render a fair amount of detail, but probably not as much as the liner brush, because it is the reflection. We don't want it stealing all of the attention away from our main subject. The more detail we put into it, the more distracting it can be, and we need to remember that it's also a reflection. We want it to look a little bit almost fuzzy looking. We don't want it to be as sharp as everything else, though reflections come in all all different aesthetics, and you are more than welcome to paint it how you'd like. If you'd want to do a perfect reflection, no changes at all, you are more than welcome to do that. If you want to go with something that's significantly more abstract, you're also welcome to do that. Though I will let you know that I think this is a really good balance, what we're going for here, and later in the lesson we're going to apply a layer on top of all of it, which allow you to remedy any larger errors you may have kind of rendered throughout the way. So don't worry about that too much. With that, I'm now moving over to the left-hand side, as you can see here, just filling in all of those trees, not only in the foreground, but also in the midground and background as well. We are working around the actual structure, and we're doing a couple of layers because, again, we don't want it to end up looking a little thin, though we could definitely go back and just do more of those layers. Now, with that, I'm going to head to my palette. We're going to grab some of our titanium white, a little bit of that ultramarine blue, mix that up so that it's nice and consistent, and then we will throw some extra titanium white in there too. And with this new pigment, we're going to brighten up some of the reflections of the trees that are really in the distance. I almost immediately realized it was still too dark, and so you know what, we add some extra titanium white, I add some extra blue so that we have that really beautiful blue atmospheric color reflecting down. And here we're just kind of trying to follow those general lines, those general movements in the background. This is going to be the first indicator of depth in our reflection. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. It can look a little loose. I am trying to loosen mine up, and I'm still holding my brush fairly close to the end of it. If you find that you have issues loosening up your stroke and making things look kind of not so stiff, try holding the brush at the very end. It will make painting a whole lot harder, but it's generally how you draw with figure drawing and when you want to kind of make things look a lot more loose and flowy. So that's something that you can also do in here as well. Just kind of keep that in the back of your head if you're ever making things that are looking, again, just a little bit too stiff. That said, here we are continuing to work on all of those backing trees. I'm not too worried about getting all of the detail in them. I just want that general feeling and that general movement to make it cohesive. So now we get to head in and add some snow to all of our trees. As per usual, we do want to make sure that our base layer is fully dry, and with that we're grabbing quite a bit of our titanium white, maybe half that in our ultramarine blue, and then the smallest hint of Mars black. You can see that I was wiping off the excess just because it's such a strong pigment, though upon testing I realized that my mixture was a little bit too bright, and so we work in some of that extra Mars black. I really do feel like the reflection will look the best when you are working with those more middle values, nothing too bright, nothing too dark, really just something to complement the top without being distracting. And here we're going to go in and start creating all of the snow. However, much like the base layer, we're doing the majority of it with a fairly vertical application, though I am allowing for a slight bend to craft the general movements of the trees, and I really like this a lot. I think that it's a great technique. It's something that we do clean up, much like we did with the trees beforehand, but it will look really fantastic when we're done. It's also worth noting that we're going to soften all of the edges here, though right now I'm going in and they're looking a little hard. So if in the process you find it doable to make all of these applications and do so with the edges being a bit more feathered, that's great. If you can do that from the start, you essentially save yourself a step a little bit later on. But here you can see my brush is running out of paint, and now I'm rendering the markings that I actually love. These are semi-transparent. They do not have sharp edges because I just don't have enough paint to render them. And this is where I really start to get inspired in this part of the process. So I'm still dancing around all of my trees, and we're almost creating a bit of a depth as well, in that the larger trees have a bit more of a stark value, where the ones that are a bit farther away are softer, they're a little bit darker. So that's pretty fun. Here I am going in to all of the edges of those markings and just blending them out slightly. You do have to do this while the paint is still wet, or you can go in with a slightly darker variant and just go around those edges. But that is definitely a technique to soften it up, which can be avoided if your initial markings and applications are just slightly less sharp than what mine were. But regardless, we were able to make it look quite good. And with that, I'm now going back to the darker base layer, and we're going to break up some of these applications in the same way we did with the actual tree. Remember, we started to create these clusters, these clumps. We brought them all together, and then we took a step back and we asked ourselves, okay, now which of these can be individual, which of these can be breaking off, and we have this general pattern and flow to it, which we're now incorporating down into this area. So I'm just trying to break apart the larger pieces and continue with the movements that were already prevalent in the tree. You know, sometimes they're slightly more to the left, sometimes they're slightly more to the right, despite the fact that they are vertical. And I think that it's coming along really wonderfully. I also like that in this process, we're softening edges and we're making them darker. So I just feel like this area gets more subtle as we go. We're not trying to interject a lot of extra contrast. We're actually trying to almost take it away while add some realistic, though distorted, visuals and movements of the foliage and the snow on top of it. So here, now we go back in the other direction. We start adding additional highlights, and this is really the acrylic painting process, isn't it? We add quite a bit of pigment, and then we work the other way, and then we add more pigment, and then we work the other way. Here I'm softening the edges of all of these, and I'm not doing so by actually blending out the current paint, but I'm going in with a middle value between the sky and the other. Here we're switching back to the liner brush, and we'll do some of the reflections of the mid-range, the midground trees. So here, same technique, except we're going more vertical than we have before. It's very, very similar once you get into the hang of it down in the reflection here. But I do think it makes it a lot of fun. And once you get your first or second subject complete, you definitely get an understanding of how to go about it. And you adopt a real confidence, which I always find is just wonderful about painting. It's either one of two things. It's questionably exploratory, and in that case it's exciting because you get to learn new things, you get to try all of these new things, and it's this really wonderful process of just figuring things out. And alternatively, on the other side of that, it's this confidence of knowing that you've done something before and you know just how to do it perfectly. You're excited about it, and I feel like that's painting. That's what it is. And you were just blending this into the larger tree, but so far so good. So we've had a couple of more relaxed steps, and now it's time to really dive into some detail. So we're going to start off with that 1/3 inch filbert brush. We have some Mars black, we're grabbing some of our ultramarine blue, titanium white, and we're crafting the base layer for our roof. Remember, we don't want this to be as dark as our previous roof, but we do want it to be fairly dark because we are working on that base layer. So once I have that mixed up, we are just going to head over into the canvas, start on the edges as we generally do, though we generally do that because we want the edges to be nice and sharp. Here, we do not. We want it to look a lot softer. We are avoiding any of those harsh edges. That is why we picked the filbert brush, and you can kind of lean on the edge, which doesn't have a sharp edge, to get that softer look. You can kind of swirl the brush a little bit to get a nice blend, and it really is just the perfect brush for this sort of scenario. So we're just going to start by blocking in this roof, as you can see here. And while I go about this, I do think it's worth noting that I mentioned earlier with acrylic paintings, generally things come together in like the final 10 to 15%. this is definitely a subject that falls into that category. It's going to look a little messy for a while. But here, as you can see, I'm taking that gray and I'm blending it down into the rest of our reflection, eliminating that hard edge. And as I go through this process, I'm essentially taking the paint from the top, dragging it down, lifting the brush off very softly so you get that semi-transparent application. And this, of course, all will work significantly better if the brush is simply damp, though not wet. If it's wet, then the paint will have a hard time just kind of sticking to the canvas. So remember, just try to find those nice balances, and I'm sure it'll work out great. With that, we are going to head back to our palette now. I'm grabbing some additional titanium white and ultramarine blue. We will need to create some highlights, and those highlights are going to be comprised of more titanium white and more ultramarine blue. It's amazing how much of this painting was done with a fairly limited palette, but you can really do a little with a lot. And I meant that the other way. You can do a lot with a little, and I think we definitely proved that in this one with our relatively limited color palette, at least for the majority of it. But here I'm going to add the snow, which is sitting on top of the roof, and we're going to, again, be very soft with our brush stroke. We don't want those hard edges, and we are going to do a very similar blend to what we did previously, but we're also going to craft all of the little movements that we have up in the top of the roof. Now, this is something that I admittedly need to go back and do 2 or 3 times. I did not sketch it out like I should have. I have the traceable. I know I could have done it, and I think I pay for it. It's sometimes a little bit difficult to do these things upside down. Some people it clicks. For me, sometimes I think it's dependent on if I'm tired or not. If I'm a little bit sleepy, then it's a bit of a challenge. And today it was a bit of a challenge, but that's okay because it is acrylic painting, and we can always go back, cover things up, and fix them. But I figured I would speed up this portion of the footage just so you didn't have to see me kind of stumble through too much. Though I did want to mention it because I do think it's important to remind you that regardless of how long you've been painting for, there are going to be steps, and even sometimes simple steps, that just don't work for whatever reason, and that's okay. Just keep a positive attitude, keep at it, and I'm sure you'll create something great. But here we are going back to the liner brush, and we are starting to create some of those nice little shingles that we have in the roof. This is something that you do want to be careful with. You probably want to use more water than you normally like to because you do want it to be fairly thin. You do want the applications to be more so soft. And there's an interesting line with water where you make the brush damp and then you can get these nice sharp opaque applications, but when you use a lot of water, generally the applications aren't opaque and they're also softer. So again, it's all about that balance, and I am trying to aim for a softness with all of this reflection here. Back to the finger painting, as you can see. Always do that when I need to kind of blend something out, but I know that the brush either has too much water or too much paint to kind of do it successfully. Though if you do that, make sure that your hands are extremely clean, that you've just washed them, that you use soap, that they do not have a lot of oils, because as soon as you touch your canvas with a very oily print, then it's very difficult to apply paint over that area, especially with water. So just be aware and be careful that if you're going to finger paint like I do, that you should keep your hands quite clean throughout the entirety of the process, just in case you need to do something like that, right? So yeah, fun little piece of information there. We are going to head back to our palette. We're grabbing some of that burnt umber, Mars black. We're grabbing some of our red, and we are now going to start mixing to create the base layer of a reflection of the log cabin. So going with, again, something dark but not quite as dark as what we previously worked with. If you have a large palette, you can actually keep the colors throughout all the stages, so you can kind of rematch to that and say, okay, we'll just make it a little bit brighter because it's the reflection and we don't want the values to be as stark. Here you can see that I'm testing in all of those shadowy areas, and I do find something that I tend to really like. So we're just going to jump into here and start filling out this area. essentially for the second time. It is upside down, but I thought another little technique you do is you can actually just flip your canvas, and that will help you paint it and make it look a little bit more realistic. So just one more thought. I didn't personally do that in this one, but it can work. And with that, we're pretty far into the painting. I believe we're past the 2 hour mark. So if you made it this far, congratulations. Make sure that you are staying hydrated. Make sure that you are having a snack if you're painting along with me. We mentioned it earlier, but I do like to mention that because I do think it has an impact on our painting and our mental health, and both of which are important. So just make sure you're taking care of yourself, and thank you for being here with me painting and just going on this journey. I really wanted to make the painting really special this year. Every year I intend to make a really nice kind of winter scene, though admittedly the last 2 years I felt a little bit rushed with it and I didn't produce the level of painting that I wanted to. But this year we took the extra week. I spent a lot of time. I redid areas. I redid portions of the painting. And I think it came out as something really special. So it means a lot that you're here working on it with me. I hope that you render something that you feel as passionate about, that you also equally love, and that you're excited to share with your loved ones as well. So with that, I'd also like to take a minute and thank everybody who is directly supporting the channel up over on Patreon. I try to do this at least once in every episode, and it's something that I'd love to say more than once, but I also don't want to kind of get too repetitive with it. But thank you for making this happen. In no way, in no world would I be able to spend the time doing what I do, making what I do, if it wasn't for you and that support. I get to teach art, I get to make art for a living, and that is very much in part because of you. So thank you for making lessons like this happen, because they couldn't happen without all of that. And I know I say it in every episode, but I hope you know that I mean it. I think during lessons like this, it really becomes evident just how lucky I am to have such an incredible community who supports me, who creates art, and who we can go through these journeys together with. So thank you for making this happen. I loved working on this lesson, and it wouldn't happen without you. The channel is predominantly fan funded. I don't run ads through the middle of the videos. We run one at the start and one at the end, but nothing in between. And if you've ever watched another 2 hour video on YouTube, you've probably seen 18 little ads in between. It's something that I never wanted to do. I didn't want to take anybody out of the immersion of the painting, and I wanted you to really sink into what we're creating. And I don't have to run those ads, and I don't have to do that because of the incredible people who do support the channel up over on Patreon. So to all of you, big thank you. I hope you're having a wonderful holiday. I hope that you're making things still and that you have a little bit of time to be creative. I know it can be really crazy, or it can be quiet, and I hope you have the right balance. I hope that you're doing well. I know it's a weird year, but I wish you the best, and I hope that again you're making things you're proud of. Like this lesson, I know that it was a really cathartic couple of days working on it for me. But with that, if you are new to the channel, if this is your first video here, Patreon, it's a great way to support the channel. Up there you can get the reference photo so you can color match. You can get the traceable so that you can get it copied onto the canvas. We also have a little post where we talk about how we go about it. I personally like to use a grid that comes with the traceable, and then I kind of sketch around the grid. It's a bit more freehand, but occasionally I will also use a mini projector. Some people use transfer paper. So there's a bunch of different options for using traceables if you're interested in that sort of thing. But we also have a bunch of bonus lessons that you can't find anywhere else. That's pretty fun. We have an exclusive Facebook group where everybody who works on the lessons posts their artwork, and it's a great place because it's a bunch of like-minded people who are working on similar things. Very, very positive. I love to pop in there and just see what everybody from the community is working on. So you can get access to that. Again, the traceables, the reference photos. There are also the ebooks, so that's fun. One of which is Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting from start to finish. We talk about what brushes to use, how much water to use, how to mix your colors to get different blends. We talk about glazing and composition, really just so many different things. So if you're interested in that, that is available up over on Patreon, along with all of my painting prompts books, which are essentially a series of ebooks which are traceables for days where you know you want to create something but you're not totally sure what you want to make. It is all of the line work. A couple of them do come with reference photos as well. So there's a bunch up over on Patreon. There will be linked in the description, and it's also just a great way to say thank you and support the channel if you'd like to. But I also understand that it's it's the holidays. Not everybody can do that sort of thing, and no pressure at all. If you are, just here watching the video on YouTube, I think that it's a great thing that you're part of the community regardless, and I'm very grateful to have you here. But I do like to take time to very specifically thank everybody up over on Patreon, because they make such a massive impact on my life, on these lessons. And again, I wouldn't be able to make them without all of that support. So thank you to everybody up there. With that, getting back to the lesson, I suppose, as you can see, we've made some progress. We are doing a lot of this with a lot of a soft blend. I'm really trying to avoid hard lines, and I am still going with a lot of those vertical strokes. I'm continuously kind of moving my brush up to the top of the canvas so I can kind of line up all of my applications. And I think that this is starting to look really, really nice, though it's not going to come together until we add the actual icy effects, which happen a little bit later in the lesson. So recognize that this is going to look a little bit messy on my piece. It's probably going to look a little bit messy on your piece. There is nothing wrong with that. And if there's an area that looks particularly messy that you don't love, don't worry. The icy technique does allow us to cover areas that aren't necessarily our favorites, so it really isn't the end of the world. Though, of course, it's acrylic and we can just paint over it if it's really not what you want it to be. But here I'm just kind of following the same general patterns and rules that I did with the first application, in that we started with the darker base layer. We started to add these warmer applications, and the warmer applications generally do start with more of a red-orange heavy mixture, and then we move to the yellow because the base layer, it has a lot of Mars black in it, and we don't want the Mars black and the cadmium yellow to mix because then they do create a green. So here we are following that general rule. I'm also making this slightly less saturated than I made the top, and we painted the majority of it with the filbert brush so that it was nice and soft, though here I am going in with the liner brush to build up that really nice warm glow that we have from the light. This is going to be a central piece in the painting, and the eye isn't going to stay on it for too long because we're not going to create that much contrast or that much detail, but it's just going to complement the top so well, and it's going to ensure that we're not kind of breaking the painting in half, one side being bright, the other side not being so, or warm really. So this is a really important part, just building this up. I'm still working on all of those supporting beams. I think they're beautiful. I do think, admittedly, I could have taken a little bit more time to straighten them out, and that is one issue I had with my reflection as I was getting towards the end of the painting, which was remedied by the icy effect. But just recognize that I am painting this slightly faster than I'd necessarily love to, and I would recommend trying to get all of that as straight and proper as you possibly can. Get those nice linear applications, make them relatively soft, especially if you have the time. So with that, we are just going back, and I don't want to do too much detail in the windows like we did at the top, because so many of those horizontal lines are small and they're going to extend vertically, right? So I actually opted to not do too much of that, and I definitely leave out a number of details in the reflection purposefully so that it doesn't steal a lot of attention from the actual building, right? We wanted to complement it, not steal the attention. And that's something I've probably said 100 times in the lesson, and I'll probably say 100 more, just because it's a really important idea. And I know when a lot of people are just starting painting, they tend to feel like they need to add so much detail everywhere. And I know I was like that 100%. I felt like, okay, you know what, that's really detailed and pretty now, and that needs to match it. So that needs to be really detailed and pretty. And eventually there was just detail everywhere, and the eye never knew where to focus. It's important to understand that some areas are supposed to be desaturated, some areas are supposed to be less complicated, so that your primary subjects can stand out, so that you can have a flow within your painting as the eye moves from the primary to secondary, tertiary subjects, and just kind of bounce around like that, right? And land where you want it to. You can kind of subconsciously guide the eye, and that's what we try to do in these lessons, rather than just making everything hyper saturated, hyper high contrast, etc. Though I like to bring this up as well. And I know we're talking about a lot of generalities where I'm painting all of this detail, and some people like that, some people don't. And it's something I tend to avoid, but we've already essentially painted the house here, and we're just kind of following a lot of those same ideas, just extending things. So I figured, you know what, we'll kind of talk about some general things that can aid you in your paintings in general. So what I wanted to talk about was the fact that there are these rules, right? We've talked a lot about how we probably want to make the sky a little bit darker in the reflection, how we want to make the darker values a little bit brighter in the reflection, how we're supposed to do all of these things, and, you know, not make everything hyper detailed or hyper saturated. That is a good set of ideas for creating traditional art. However, they aren't the only ways of going about things. And I love taking artistic liberties. I love making pieces of my own, interjecting my thoughts. And you can really go the distance with that. You can make a hyper saturated painting where every single piece of it is a vibrant color. You can make a painting where nothing is sharp at all. You can do so much. And painting is meant to be a cathartic process. It's meant to be something that makes you happy, that fulfills you, and it's okay to have other styles, other ideas, other color palettes that, you know, inspire you, and you can break those rules. You can make your art the way you want to make it. And I always want these lessons, I want to stress this, I always want these lessons to help you along the way, to offer ideas, to present you with information that you can implement, or you could choose to not implement. Just because I've been doing this for as long as I have, or just because I went to school for it, doesn't mean that my way of painting is the definitively correct way of painting. You create art the way you want to, and you do what makes you passionate, what drives you. Take the ideas from me that you like, enjoy them, learn from them, but don't ever feel like they're handcuffing you, and always feel welcome to, you know, try going against what I suggest in these lessons. You might come up with something really interesting. And I think that's so important to note. Art is incredibly subjective. What looks great is different to all of us, and I just want to encourage you to make what you want to make, and always remember that. Don't let people tell you that you have to make art in a very specific way. Make your art the way you want to. But with that, I'm going back into a lot of the highlights here. We're adding some orange and a glow to a lot of this using that wonderful little finger painting technique. And that's something you can actually do up at the top with the light as well. It's something that I didn't do until the very end of the lesson. I'm not even sure if I got it on camera, but it's essentially doing exactly what I'm doing down there up at the top to get that warmer glow, and so that a lot of those different elements come together with a very similar atmosphere. It will take down a lot of the darker values and subdue them, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if it's coming from a light source and it's emitting out there. We're essentially just doing a bit of a glaze without the water. But with that, we're going to move on to the next step, where I'm going to grab some of our Mars Black, a little bit of our Ultramarine Blue, hint of that Titanium White, and now we're going to create that snowy base yet again. This time it's going to be the reflection, so we know it needs to be quite dark, and I'm doing quite a number of tests. Each time I'm kind of feeling like, oh, it's a little bit too dark, because we do want to make it slightly, again, softer so that it doesn't steal the attention. But I do opt for something that is a little bit darker because we are getting so close to the actual subject. I think in general I like things to look more natural in a reflection as they get closer to the subject, and more faded, less punchy as we get farther away. So I figured, you know what, here we would go with those darker pigments. I'm using that filbert brush. I'm trying to blend it as best I can into our previous applications, as you can see right here. And you can even mix up the slightly brighter bluish grays to kind of move on top of it, which is what I'm doing. And I think that this was actually the perfect technique for this specific area. I really like how that all turned out. And I guess I'd also like to note that the reflection isn't going to be perfect up at this top area because the image itself is being distorted in the reflection, right? And we don't actually get to see the entirety of the reflection because there are actual subjects in the way. So we get to be pretty loose with this area, and I think that makes it a lot of fun. Again, it's one of those places where it doesn't have to be perfectly visually technically correct to look great, and you can just enjoy the process and make it how you want to. But I do try to create a little bit of a blend between the ice and the land there. I want a line between them, but I don't want it to be all that stark. I'm also now going in with some titanium white and just kind of extending things, but I definitely do need to go back and brighten a lot of the snow because it's quite dark around the lip here, though it's difficult to add that highlight at this point because we do have a lot of darker pigment. It would definitely be easier to let all of that dry right now and then come back in 5 minutes later with a significantly brighter application, right? So that is what we opt to do. I switch to the liner brush and I say, okay, you know what, let's add the snow that is on the rock wall. So we just throw that on to both the center and the left hand side. Then we go in to tap on some of those nice little bricks that we have. So again, utilizing that burnt umber, though these bricks are going to be applied not necessarily horizontally but vertically now, right? That is the general rule that we're working with, and I think that it's starting to turn out really, really nicely. Though I am noticing on camera, I think because of the angle in which I filmed, the house, the cabin, kind of looks like it's a little bit tilted, but it doesn't necessarily look like that on in real life. It's worth noting that DSLRs, what I use to film, can distort, especially if you're filming quite up close, and I was with this one with the lens I wanted to use. So that is kind of a funny thing that you may see or experience when you watch people paint things like cities or buildings. The perspective might actually be correct, but the lens itself is distorting, and I think we're getting a little bit of that. It's not far off. I don't think anyone would have noticed, but I see it now, and I'm looking at it and I'm saying, you know what, that doesn't that doesn't look exactly like my painting. That's interesting. Though that's a good lesson for all of you who photograph your artwork. If you are photographing your artwork, if you can, try to take a picture from a little bit of a distance, because the farther away the canvas is, the safer it is from that distortion. So just try to keep that in mind. Something I definitely try to do. And also try to photograph your paintings in natural light, but in the shade. That's generally how you get the best pictures of it, the most accurate pictures of it. So I normally I finish the painting and then I wait for kind of a cloudy day or a cloudy portion of a day to take that picture, and that's kind of how we go about things. So not necessarily a painting tip, but certainly one that'll I think aid a lot of you in getting your artwork out there on different social medias and whatnot. But here we are going back to that darker lip of snow that we worked on earlier. I did note that it was very wet and that going back in and adding pigment would just be quite the battle, because the darker pigments do overwhelm the lighter pigments quite easily. So we let that dry. Now we're coming back and we're having a much easier job of cleaning all of this up. I'm also not incorporating much of our ultramarine blue in this snow right here, and you can really tell if you look up at the clouds in the sky in the distance. And I'm doing this purposefully because I want this gray to look a little bit warmer than all of the other grays, as it's really in between the light from the cabin and the reflection of the light of the cabin. So I do want to make this a bit warmer. Now we get to add a very fun effect to our painting. And we're going to do so with the 1-inch flat-headed brush. You can see in the reference photo that there actually isn't a reflection, but you can see through the water, and there are all of these little logs in there. But it inspired me to create a reflective icy effect. And I'm going to show you exactly how I go about doing that. So here we're taking quite a bit of our titanium white, little bit of Mars black, little bit of our ultramarine blue. I go in to test it and I realize, you know what, that is far too bright. We do not want it to be that prominent, because we don't want it to steal the attention away from our other subjects, and we're going to do quite a lot of it. So we work in some extra Mars black. I go for a test and I do like that a lot. So now I'm going to take quite a bit of water. I'm going to move that paint out on my palette to the point where this looks a little bit like watercolor, to the point where the paint may start dripping and you don't actually have much paint on your brush, but you have a lot of water, very similar to if you wanted to glaze. And now I'm going to work back and forth very softly on top of my reflection, and make sure that your reflection is dry before you go in to do this. But here we're going to start to create all of these scratches over the reflection, as if someone was skating on it for the afternoon, a couple, a family. And this is really fun because we get to add this new layer of depth, right? This is something that is on top of everything else we've applied. We have an opportunity to cover up any portion that we don't necessarily love by going over it a couple of times, adding multiple layers, though we are following the general rule that I've talked about throughout the lesson, in that we are doing all of it subtly, and then we're going back over it and we're doing all of it subtly again, and we're just building it up as we go. If I get any area that I've accidentally kind of applied too much pressure with, or perhaps there's an area of my brush that had a lot of paint and I didn't realize it and it wasn't watered down, and I get this thick application, I do, use my pinky finger to rip that paint off the canvas, or I'll make my brush a little bit more wet and then I'll head into that area on the canvas. But here we essentially want to start with a lot of semi-transparent horizontal marks, and sometimes with my brush I'm using the very sharp edge to get a nice clean cut line, but other times I'm using the entirety of the head of the brush and getting what is, as you can see here, a bit more of a granular effect, something that's a bit more wide, a bit more subtle, and I like that a lot. I love the granular effect down here in the reflection. I think that it looks like just sprinkled snow on top of the ice. I think it's a really beautiful look. So here we have our first application. I think that so far so good. It's quite subtle. There's definitely a lot of room for addition and improvement, and we're really going to go at it here. So you can slowly brighten it as you go. We definitely went ahead and did that, and now the value of it matches that of the snow on the roof of our reflection. So it's going to start to all blend together in a really nice way, though none of our applications or blends are necessarily soft. So we're going to get a lot of texture in the foreground, which I like a lot. It definitely keeps the eye in the general area, though because we worked with values that weren't that bright and weren't that dark, at no point is it going to steal the attention away from our true main subject. So it's all about finding that balance, ensuring that it's captivating but not too captivating. And here I didn't necessarily adore all of the reflections of the windows, so I definitely apply extra highlight to that area. And an area that I'm specifically avoiding is the heart of the very warm glow, that reflection there. I love that color. I really like the general movements of it. We had to cover it a little bit so that it was cohesive and it matched with everything else, but for the most part I wanted to leave that relatively untouched. And so you'll see that I'm working more so with the left hand side bottom corner and more towards the top right of the reflection. That way we have the highlights on the right and left hand side of the canvas. That way we have highlights on the top and bottom of the reflection area, but we aren't at any point kind of disturbing my favorite portions of the reflection. And I know I know we put a lot of work into the reflection, and it can be a little scary to cover it up with something like this, but it's okay. We're going to start with a very minimal amount. We're going to make sure that our underlayer is fully dry before we start, and we're going to do a great job. We'll just add up those layers. Every time you add the layers, you'll probably learn a little something. You'll probably get a little bit better at the actual technique. I'm going in with a very soft touch, by the way, through all of this. At no point am I actually adding any pressure with my brush. And here we're really using that finger painting to smooth out all of these applications, because I think that they're a little bit too bright and a little bit too sharp. So we're softening it with our finger, both value-wise and structurally. I think it's working really well. You can also create lanes essentially of these reflections. You can see that it kind of winds through the bottom portion, and that is very much intentional. I am trying to create a bit of a leading line that kind of moves you into the painting, into the reflection of the light. And so I'm slowly adding to that, slowly building to it, but I never want it to be hyper noticeable. I don't want it to look like an actual pathway. I just want it to look like a lucky coincidence that these scratches in the ice lead us back to all of these highlights and the really beautiful cabin. I wanted to have a bit of a magical effect like that. So that is definitely what we are doing. I threw a little bit up in the top right hand corner as well, just because I wanted to balance that area with everything else. It was a little barren. It didn't have that same technique, and we didn't connect it to anything, so it isn't all that prominent, but it definitely feels cohesive with the rest of it, and that's what we want. Again, it's another word that I've probably said 100 times. I'll probably say 100 more times, but it's just so important when working on pieces like this. And now we're just going in with some final little highlights for this part of the step. So now we're going to grab our liner brush, make sure that it's nice and damp, grab a little bit of our ultramarine blue, about double that in titanium white, and what you are currently watching us mix is going to be the final pigment which brings this painting to fruition. That said, I am going to also grab a small hint of Mars Black as well. I really want this to be quite bright, but not as bright as the brightest areas of snow. I wanted to complement the other blues in the painting, but not overwhelm them. So with that, I take quite a bit of water, work that into our mixture. I go back for more water, work that into the mixture. So much like the icy application, this is much like a glaze. It's very, very thin, and that's exactly what we want. We are pushing our brush towards the canvas, peeling back the bristles, launching that paint at the canvas. If you've watched any of the space paintings on the channel, you're probably very familiar with this technique, but it's a great way of rendering just hundreds of little implications so quickly. Markings that are small to the point that you couldn't render them by tapping them onto the canvas, and it does so randomly, which is wonderful. Though while I say randomly, you do have some level of control. By adjusting how far or close you are to the canvas, you can make your actual splatters larger or smaller. If you get really close to the canvas and you angle your brush, you can create very specific line work or put it in an area that you want it to be, an area that might feel is missing some of it. So it's a really wonderful technique. Again, it's something that you can play with. It's something that can unify it, because now the entirety of the painting is going to have this very soft snow flurry on top of it, and it's going to bring it all together. Though admittedly, as you can see, it is going to take a little while. I do like to take my time here and just make sure that we don't do too much in any one area at once. And it's a wonderful process. It's watching the painting come together. And with that, this is really the final step. There are touch-ups which you could do right before you do this. You can play with your colors, with your brightness levels, with your contrast. You can have a lot of fun with it. But once we start to add the snow here, this is really putting those final touches in and concluding what has been a really wonderful painting journey. So with that, thank you for joining me. As per usual, I do like to leave a little bit of a code word at the end of the video, just something that you can leave in the comments to note that you are one of the dedicated few who did make it to the end. I get the percentages and the analytics of how far people make it, and not too many people do make it to this point. So if you are one of them, congratulations. Thank you for being one of the very dedicated members of the community, and I have no doubt that if you watch this lesson all the way through, you're going to end up with something that you really appreciate. So thank you. I hope you feel like you learned something, and the word for the day is going to be a little bit different, not going with an individual word. I'd love to hear in the comment section about one of your favorite holiday memories. Could be Christmas, could be just a winter memory, really. Something to do with the season and the snow. I'd love to hear it. I love warm stories. I love sharing those sorts of things, and I very much look forward to reading them. So many of us, we've got to know each other over the years through this channel, and I can't wait to see what you write, what your experiences were, and I think that'll just be a great way of marking who did kind of get to the end. So feel free to share. I'd love to hear it. Could be short, could be long, up to you. But yeah, thank you for being here. Of course, everybody up over on Patreon, thank you for directly supporting the channel, making this lesson happen. If you'd like to support the channel up on Patreon, there's a link in the description, and up there you can get the traceables, the reference photos, the ebooks, access to the exclusive Facebook group, the bonus lessons, so many things to be found up there. And again, it does mean a lot. So thank you to everybody who's up there. Thank you to everybody who just made it this far in the lesson. I hope that you feel like you learned a lot. I hope that you are excited and just ready to get to painting, that you feel like you have a little bit of time to do so, and that you enjoyed the lesson here with me today. I do intend to do a couple more winter scenes and some other very fun ideas in the near future, so I will see you fairly soon. But as per usual, thank you, and stay creative. Have wonderful holidays. Make sure that you are drinking water, having some food while you go through the longer painting process. And yeah, so thank you, take care, and have a lovely day, have a lovely evening.